The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is a proud supporter of Indian Country Today. Students at Cronkite News and Gaylord College at the University of Oklahoma cover indigenous communities together. This important work is distributed by more than 100 news organizations. This collaboration provides a much-needed boost to coverage of Native American communities nationwide. Learn more at cronkitenews.azpbs.org.
This is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Thalohungva. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland joined natives on the National Mall to welcome a totem pole made by master carvers from the Lummi Nation. This is the Red Road to D.C. tour, which started in Washington state and has traveled across the country, stopping to honor sacred indigenous places along the way. The 25-foot-tall totem pole weighs 5,000 pounds and is carved from a single red cedar tree. It was made to pressure the federal government to take action to protect endangered areas that have cultural and holy significance to Native people. The ceremony continues tomorrow, and the totem pole will be on display in front of the National Museum of the American Indian through the weekend. Tribes in Nevada are opposing a planned mine there. A U.S. federal judge ruled this week that tribal nations are able to join a lawsuit to stop construction of a proposed lithium mine in Nevada. The mine would be built through Thacker Pass and is being planned by the Lithium Americas Corporation. Already, tribal nations have said the project site is a sacred place to the Fort McDermott Paiute Shoshone tribe. Other tribes in Nevada say they will file a new injunction opposing the site, saying it will destroy historical places of significance. Member tribes of the Intertribal Council of Nevada, which includes 27 tribes in the state, issued a resolution in June saying they feel the Bureau of Land Management rushed to approve the construction's environmental impact statement under the Trump administration. Officials say the lawsuit is still in its early stages. And in Canada, the head of a mining company is defending comments saying Maine is a good place to do business because of tribes' lack of rights. Wolfton Resources wants to develop a precious minerals mine in rural Maine. Its CEO, Ron Little, is facing criticism because of comments he made during a presentation to investors. In that meeting, Little said there are no Indigenous rights in the state of Maine, and that streamlines the permitting process. The Natural Resources Council of Maine, which opposes the mining project, shared the videos with tribes in Maine. Penobscot Nation Chief Kirk Francis says Little's statement is obviously not an accurate comment. The CEO doubled down, saying one of the biggest risks is that the Indigenous community might have a veto to not allow a project. The mining project still needs state approvals to go forward. The Crow Indian tribe in Montana filed a civil complaint against the Bureau of Indian Affairs, alleging excessive use of force by an officer. The complaint names Officer Steve Stallings, accusing him of violent abuse of power and excessive force during a July traffic incident. The claim says Stallings allowed a canine dog to latch onto the victim, and the dog would not release its hold. A video was taken by the victim's wife, who put it on social media. It shows the man was not resisting. Still, Officer Stallings could not gain control of the dog to release the victim. David Sibley is the Crow tribe's prosecutor. He released this statement. We have seen the unnecessary and excessive use of force from a few poorly trained law enforcement officers across the United States, and we are not immune on the Crow Nation. The tribe is charging Officer Stallings with aggravated assault, criminal endangerment, and negligent endangerment. Well, COVID-19 vaccines are making its way into the Yurichipa people who live in some of Bolivia's most rural areas. This is part of an effort by the government to reach remote and diverse Indigenous communities. Many Indigenous leaders also traveled to the towns to promote the vaccination drive among community members. According to government figures, nearly 3.8 million Bolivians have had at least one shot, but that's just 7% of the target population. And despite aiming to vaccinate 1,200 people in the town, authorities have been able to administer shots to only 77 people so far. Nalia Mamini, a Chipaya community member, is one of the few who are stepping up to get vaccinated. Omanini says she would like her people to do whatever is needed to stay healthy.
I'd say that the community has to make themselves vaccinated because that is what we need to be well.
According to Johns Hopkins University, the country's coronavirus death toll is more than 17,000. The first Hmong American to make the Olympic team is also celebrating her first Olympic gold medal. Sunisa Lee stood on top of the podium in Tokyo after winning an all-around medal in gymnastics. The all-around competition is a culmination of scores from the vault, uneven bars, balance beam, and floor routine events. Lee is 18 years old and comes from Minnesota. Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan posted this tweet. Congratulations to Suni Lee, women's all-around gold medal champion. We are so proud of you. The roar you hear from Minnesota is all the love and excitement we're sending to you in Tokyo. Go, Sunalisa. And those are the headlines from Indian Country Today. I'm Patty Thalohungva. Tim Giago was the founder of our news organization, Indian Country Today. It began as the Lakota Times. We'll hear how his journalism stood up against injustices.
And another sports team gets rid of its native mascot and name. In this edition, we tackle stereotypes.
This is Indian Country Today.
Charlene Teters was a graduate student in the late 1980s at the University of Illinois when she came face to face with the harmful effects of native mascots. Her children had powerful reactions when they saw the school's mascot dressed in face paint, feathers, and so-called war chants. Teters is a citizen of the Spokane tribe. That experience led her to a lifetime cause to get rid of native mascots. Chief Ilanowick was her first target. In later years, she led hundreds of rallies to gain support to get rid of negative native mascots and imagery. In 1997, Teters was the subject of a PBS documentary, In Whose Honor. Charlene Teters joins us now to talk about the Cleveland team announcing its name change.
You know, when I first began to address this issue as a student, I really thought that they just didn't understand. And if I told them, they would start to make adjustments. However, this has been a long and ongoing journey, which didn't start with me. It actually, began decades before me at Dartmouth and Stanford, where students recognize that these images actually become kind of a barrier for people seeing us as contemporary 21st century people. So for me, I also had kind of an awakening, realizing that the use of this imagery by a mainstream institution like the University of Illinois or by national sports teams, that it creates an ignorance in the mainstream America about who we are as real people. If they see us as cartoon caricatures, like the Cleveland Indian logo, then they don't see us having real issues, real problems. We are people just like any other people. So it's important that these stereotypes go away, like Little Black Sambo and the Frito Bandito and some of those other caricatures that dehumanize a people. There is a connection between all of the other issues that we're dealing with in Indian country, that we have the highest teen suicide rates in our communities. That's all connected to how we see ourselves and how others see us, that our graves are desecrated, that our tribal leaders are not respected. When we pass resolutions that represent the duly elected tribal leadership's point of view on an issue, like the National Congress of American Indians passed resolutions on this very issue a long time ago, in the 60s, the first one, that it can be ignored because they don't see our tribal leadership as anything important.
For years, Teters joined Native Americans living in Cleveland in protest over the team's name.
The reason that many of them are there is because of the relocation program in the 1950s. So these are many generations after that relocation. They're in Cleveland, but they didn't melt into the dominant society. They are still Native. They know who they are. They know where they come from. They were out protesting every game, every first game, and they asked for people to come and support them. And I always tried to go for the first game in April to stand with these very courageous Native community in Cleveland. And it was also there that I was arrested and kept for 24 hours along with other people. So Cleveland is one of those places that was really very hostile towards real Native people. As much as they say they love Indians, and that's why we have this image, when real Native people are speaking about issues of concern to their community, they don't want to hear about it. You know, I really thought that this was going to go on for a while because the quality of the discussion and the debate hadn't improved very much. Some of the same things I heard 30 years ago, I was still hearing from community members. And, you know, let's face it, we also have Native people who also embrace these images, wear the cap, you know, so it's a long and ongoing struggle to make the connection for people that, you know, we are the best representations of our culture, not these stereotypes that come from pop culture.
That was Charlene Teters, a longtime warrior against Indian mascot names. In Las Vegas, I had a chance to profile a business that's busting stereotypes. Boy, that is a palate cleaner. When Rudy Rojas recently entered the market of creating and selling alcohol products, he knew there were only a few Native people in Southern California who already were doing so. The Rincon Band's Reservation Brewery, which sells craft beer, and Quito Wines. Rojas wanted to dip into a market selling premium tequila, so he founded Native Spirits LLC less than 2 years ago, after many years of running a successful clothing brand.
Grown my clothing line to be a national brand in Indian country. I knew that anything I created was representing all of us. So I just didn't pump stuff out there to produce it, make a buck.
The company was in Las Vegas last week at the National Indian Gaming Association conference in hopes of partnering with casinos. The idea is that casinos could take the brand and put their own label on it as a marketing strategy.
It's all about sales, it's all about branding, but it's all about providing a great quality product.
The tequila is crafted at an award-winning distillery in Jalisco, Mexico, and currently features 3 different types of tequilas that are 100% organic. One of the casinos that serves this brand is Viejas Casino and Resort in Southern California. In Las Vegas, Mark Trahant, Indian Country Today. On most Indian reservations across the country, you'll meet res dogs, sometimes roaming free, sometimes the pride of the tribe, and their owners. Lori Edmo has this report.
About 30 Fort Hall summer recreation participants, along with adults, brought their canine friends to the Fort Hall ball field to compete for the smallest, largest, smartest, cutest, and top res dog. The contest has been going on for 15 years, but was sidelined last year because of the pandemic. Participants appeared to be happy again to be on the field amid the barking and the struggle to hang on to their dogs.
The Res Dog contest started probably at least 15 years ago. And what it originally was is actual res dogs. The kids would go out and get res dogs and bring them to the contest. And it wasn't as big as it is today. We didn't have all the categories in that time. Like now we have the biggest, the smallest, the cutest, and we have 5 different categories now. But at that time, there was just the res dog.
There was one year when kids literally found a res dog on the way to the gym, and they just put a rope on it, and then the owner came looking for it, and they were like, "Oh, you can keep the stuff," but my dog made it to the res dog contest without me because the kids around here just run the area, and it's nice to be back in here because COVID stopped it last year. So we're excited to have some dogs here.
Paco, owned by Mitten LeClaire, was named the top res dog.
This is Paco. And he's 15 years old. He's a little Pomeranian. And we rescued him from a truck that threw him out on Highline Road quite a few years ago when he was just little. And he's been ours ever since.
In Fort Hall, Idaho, Lori Edmo, Indian Country Today.
40 years ago, the Lakota Times rolled off the press in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, published by Tim Giago. That paper would later become Indian Country Today. Shirley Snavy caught up with Tim at Native Son News in Rapid City, South Dakota.
In 4 decades, it's safe to say Tim Giago has covered all the angles. So when I asked him about the stories he enjoyed, he didn't disappoint.
My goodness, there's been so many of them for 40 years. I think it's always exciting when we first started out to cover our first tribal elections. That was way back in the 80s, and it's our first try ever at covering a political campaign for some of the candidates, and so it kind of gave us a feel of how to handle elections from then on, and I think that was a good thing, because elections are so important, you know, on the tribal elections.
He brought attention to Indian country stories that needed to be told, and he did it because he knew journalism and freedom of the press is a constitutional right.
I think a newspaper has a responsibility, if it's a minority paper, to also be an advocate for its readers. And there was a time in the 1980s when we had heard rumors that the banks in the border towns like Chadron and Rushville and Martin were charging higher interest rates to Native Americans. So we did a story on it, and the Justice Department came out after reading the story, and they fined all the banks and stopped what they call redlining. So that was a good thing that we did. Back in 1989, I did an interview with Governor George Mickelson, and he was kind of bothered by the relations that the state and the tribal governments had. And I asked him, I said, well, what is your hardest part of your job as governor? He said, I'll tell you the same thing my father told me when he was a governor 40 years ago, tribal relations, Indians and whites. He said, I'm going to try to do something to improve on that. And it just so happened, it was 1989, and the coming year would be the 100th anniversary of the massacre at Wounded Knee. So I thought that would be a good catalyst to maybe start getting things done. Maybe the legislature would be open to it. So we came up with the idea of a year of reconciliation for 1990 and doing away with Columbus Day and replacing it with Native American Day. And we did all this just by discussion and by writing. You know, we didn't protest, use any violence or anything else, but it got done. So we now have Native American Day. I think we're still the only state in the Union that celebrates Native American Day as a holiday.
One of the things that separates Giago from the pack is his willingness to bring up painful issues like boarding schools to really make his readers think. He was a student at Holy Rosary and wrote often about that experience, starting in the early years of the newspaper.
Well, I think it kind of started early, because one of the first things that we started to do was look at the boarding schools. We wrote about the boarding schools 40 years ago, and right now it's all over the place because of the bodies they're finding up in Kamloops in Canada. And we've said all along that go to any of the schools like St. Francis, Holy Rosary, and you're going to find graves up there of kids that are buried in unmarked graves. And I wrote about when Bozo Richards died. He was 16 years old, and they assigned me and Roch Red Elk to dig his grave. We're 14 or 15 years old, and we're up there digging a grave for one of our friends. And while I was in the grave swinging my pick, I hit something and I pulled it up, and it was a little skull stuck on the end of my pick. So we dug into a child's grave. So those are the things that people try to keep quiet. You know, I think the schools, the boarding schools, did so much damage to the Indian children, and we tried to talk about those things. We interviewed a lot of the students that were badly abused at these schools, and some of them totally ruined their lives. A lot of them ended up in prison, some of them committed murders, others became alcoholics and drug addicts. So we saw generations of children, maybe 3 generations that were impacted by the boarding schools. And no one was covering that except us back then.
Giago mentored many writers, artists, and reporters, and along the way they won hundreds of awards for journalism.
I remember one day I was at work, and this big old heavyset guy walked in and introduced himself and said, "I'm Paiute from Nevada." He said, "And I really like your paper, and I'd like to go to work for you." And his name was Adrian Lewis. And so Adrian came and was one of the really great writers, did great stories. In fact, I often talk about a column he did where he was observing sheets hanging on a clothesline outside of his window at his apartment. And he did a whole story on sheets that related to a lot of things that we never think about. You know, that's how good a writer he was. He eventually became my managing editor, and he passed away. And one of the guys now that's being considered for a Pulitzer, Marty Tubles, he came into my office in 1988, him and his wife, and I hired them both. Put her in the business office, and I put him in the production department, assembling ads. And one day I did an editorial, and I took it to him. I said, "See if you can do a cartoon to this," because he had a good hand in art. So he did a cartoon for the editorial, and from then on, every week I'd give him my editorial, and he'd do the cartoons for it. So he got to start doing cartoons. So he was another one, and Tom Littleman was another great artist that we had. And I wish that we could assemble all the cartoons he did for us over the years and put them into a book, but he passed away also. But I have some really people I'm proud of that worked for me at the early days when you really needed good minds.
At the 2019 conference of the Native American Journalists Association, an organization he helped found, Tim was able to meet some of the next generation of Indian Country Today, nearly 40 years after he founded the paper. Tim celebrated his 87th birthday recently, and he says he's finally ready to retire. He wants to write another book for the next chapter of his life. His legacy will live on through the many folks he mentored. In Rapid City, South Dakota, Shirley Snavy, Indian Country Today.
Native tribes in Alaska face a certain amount of stereotypes. But here's a story that goes beyond that, and some might say beyond belief. But the Alaska Native games serve a purpose and have been adaptive for centuries. Drea Yazzie reports.
The seal hop is a game of endurance and strength. In this push-up or planking position, the athlete has only knuckles and toes touching the floor. They hop forward as far as possible. This game mimics a seal's movement and is used by hunters trying to get closer to the seals. Kyle Worrell from Juneau, Alaska, hopped over 154 feet, blowing out his competition. He says the sport is based on the skills needed to hunt seals.
The story behind the game is that this was based on a hunting technique to sneak up to seals laying out on the ice floe. And so hunters realized if they simply tried to walk up to a seal, the seal's going to see them come and it's going to dive down back in the ocean, and they're going to lose that opportunity to have a seal to bring home to feed their community.
Welcome to the 60th Annual World Eskimo Indian Olympics, where athletes are excited to get back into competition after having a year off due to the pandemic. Samantha Mogg, like many athletes, participated in more than one event.
I do Eskimo stick pull, Indian stick pull, grease pole walk, and air pull.
Medals are bestowed upon those who show great strength, agility, and persistence. However, the competition is much more than that.
It's called the Olympics or competition, but really it's a celebration of our culture and our people. And so you go to the event and it's healing, and you're constantly running into friends and family, and the sportsmanship is one of the most powerful aspects of the games. Is all the athletes are there supporting each other and holding each other up, no matter your experience levels.
Many Alaska Native families still rely on subsistence living. Kelly Lincoln from Bethel, Alaska, showed physical agility skinning a seal in under 2 minutes and 8 seconds. The ear weight is another popular game. The strength resembles endurance to frostbite. This year's winner was Frank Lane from Kotzebue, Alaska, who made it 503 feet. This premier event originated as a form of communication. When whales or other game were hunted, a messenger ran back within sight of the village and would jump and kick on one or both feet in the air to communicate they were on their way back. In Phoenix, Drea Yazzie, Indian Country Today.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Trahant.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
This is Indian Country Today.